In this episode, we focus on the difference between having policies and standards and actually living by them. Because in governance, the existence of a rule is not the same thing as adherence to that rule. For brand new learners, it can be tempting to believe that once an organization writes a policy, trains people, and publishes the document, the work is mostly done. In reality, adherence drifts over time for predictable reasons, such as turnover, workload pressure, changing systems, new vendors, and the natural human tendency to take shortcuts when nobody is watching. Continuous monitoring and reporting exist to counter that drift, not by policing people, but by making risk posture visible so leaders can correct course before small deviations become big incidents. Monitoring and reporting also support fairness, because they replace rumors and anecdotes with evidence. When adherence is measured consistently, leaders can see where standards are being followed, where exceptions are accumulating, and where exposure is growing. By the end of this lesson, you should understand what continuous adherence monitoring means, why it matters to enterprise risk optimization, and how reporting should be designed to drive action rather than to create bureaucracy. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Risk policies and standards describe expectations for how the enterprise manages exposure, such as how access should be granted, how changes should be introduced, how data should be handled, and how incidents should be escalated. Policies often express the intent and the rules at a higher level, while standards often define the specific requirements or minimum controls that make the policy real. Adherence means the enterprise's actual behavior matches those expectations in day-to-day work. A critical beginner insight is that adherence is not binary, because some areas can be highly compliant while others drift, and even within one area, adherence can vary by service criticality, team maturity, or workload pressure. This is why continuous monitoring is valuable. It detects patterns of drift before they become normalized and invisible. It also helps leadership prioritize improvement work, because the enterprise cannot fix everything at once and needs to know where gaps are most meaningful. When you monitor adherence continuously, you turn policies from static statements into living guardrails that influence behavior over time. Continuous monitoring begins with deciding what to monitor, because not every policy requirement is equally important or equally measurable. A practical governance approach focuses first on high-impact standards that strongly influence risk outcomes, such as identity and access practices, change governance discipline, monitoring and incident response readiness, and data handling controls. The goal is to choose indicators that reveal whether risk controls are functioning in reality, not just whether paperwork exists. For example, if a standard requires that privileged access be reviewed, a meaningful adherence measure would reflect whether reviews happen on schedule and whether issues are resolved, not just whether a review template exists. If a standard requires change approvals for certain systems, an adherence measure might track whether changes follow the required process and how many changes occur as exceptions. Selecting the right measures is part of risk optimization because measures drive attention and behavior, and a measure that is easy but meaningless can create a false sense of safety. When monitoring focuses on what matters most, it becomes an enterprise steering tool rather than a compliance scoreboard. Monitoring must be continuous in a way that fits enterprise reality, which means the organization needs a rhythm that is frequent enough to detect drift, but not so frequent that it becomes noise. Continuous does not always mean real-time for everything, because some adherence checks are best reviewed weekly or monthly, while others might need near-immediate visibility in critical environments. The key idea is that adherence is tracked as an ongoing trend, not as an annual snapshot. Annual snapshots can miss long periods of non-adherence and can encourage last-minute scrambling that fixes appearances rather than underlying behavior. Continuous monitoring supports prevention because it allows teams to correct small issues early, such as a backlog of overdue reviews or a growing number of exceptions, before those issues create serious exposure. It also helps leadership see whether adherence is improving over time as a result of training and process refinement. The goal is stable visibility that supports steady improvement, not a flood of alerts that people ignore. A major part of continuous monitoring is dealing with exceptions properly, because exceptions are where governance can quietly lose credibility. An exception is a permitted deviation from a standard, usually because meeting the standard immediately is not feasible due to constraints such as legacy systems, vendor limitations, or transition timelines. Exceptions can be necessary and responsible, but only if they are controlled, time-limited, owned, and monitored. If exceptions are easy to obtain and never expire, standards become optional and adherence reporting becomes meaningless. Continuous monitoring therefore tracks not only compliance and noncompliance, but also the exception population, including how many exceptions exist, how long they have been open, and whether they have compensating measures. Leaders need to see whether exceptions are increasing in certain areas, because that can indicate structural problems like underfunding, unrealistic standards, or operational overload. Monitoring exceptions also supports risk optimization because it allows leadership to decide whether to invest in remediation, adjust timelines, or revise standards to fit reality while still protecting objectives. When exceptions are monitored transparently, standards remain credible even when perfect adherence is not immediately achievable. Reporting is the companion to monitoring, and reporting must be designed for the audience and for decision-making. Reporting to frontline teams should be detailed enough to support corrective action, such as identifying which services are drifting and which requirements are missed. Reporting to leaders should be summarized and framed in enterprise impact terms, such as which critical capabilities are exposed due to adherence gaps and whether overall posture is improving or worsening. A common failure is reporting that is either too technical for leadership or too vague to be actionable, and both failures create frustration. Decision-ready reporting usually includes trends over time, comparisons to tolerances, and clear statements of what actions are being taken. It also avoids burying important signals in long lists of minor issues, because leaders need to focus on what could materially affect objectives. When reporting is well-designed, it reduces politics because it anchors discussions in evidence. It also supports accountability because owners can be identified and progress can be tracked. Continuous adherence monitoring also depends on consistent definitions and consistent measurement methods, because without consistency, trends cannot be trusted. If a team changes how it counts compliance, it might look like adherence improved when it actually did not. If different teams interpret the same standard differently, enterprise-wide reporting becomes unfair and confusing. This is why governance programs invest in standard definitions, standard measurement approaches, and periodic validation that the measurement is still accurate. Validation does not require complicated auditing in every case, but it does require checks that the reported adherence matches reality, such as cross-checking process records with operational outcomes or examining whether reported compliance aligns with incident patterns. When the enterprise trusts the measurement, it is more likely to act on it. When measurement is disputed, reporting turns into debates about numbers rather than decisions about risk reduction. Trust in measurement is therefore a risk control by itself because it enables timely action. Another essential aspect is linking adherence monitoring to risk outcomes, because adherence has meaning only if it changes exposure and helps protect objectives. If an enterprise measures adherence but never connects it to incident reduction, reliability improvement, or reduced exposure indicators, teams may see monitoring as busy work. A mature approach includes both adherence measures and outcome measures, such as whether critical incidents decrease as adherence improves or whether recovery performance improves as response standards are followed more consistently. This linkage helps leadership justify investments in adherence, such as training, process improvements, or automation of routine checks, because they can see the value. It also helps identify where standards might need refinement, because if adherence is high but risk outcomes remain poor, the enterprise may be measuring the wrong thing or using controls that are not effective. Continuous monitoring is therefore part of a learning system, not just an enforcement system. When the enterprise learns which standards truly influence outcomes, it can strengthen those and simplify others. Continuous monitoring also supports risk optimization by enabling proportional oversight based on criticality. Not every service needs the same level of scrutiny, and attempting to monitor everything with equal intensity can overwhelm teams and reduce focus on what matters. A risk-based approach monitors critical services and high-impact controls more closely while using lighter oversight for lower-impact areas. This ensures that governance effort is invested where it reduces exposure most. It also encourages teams to classify services and capabilities appropriately because criticality drives monitoring expectations and resource allocation. When criticality is clear, leadership can interpret adherence gaps more accurately, understanding that a minor deviation in a low-impact area is not the same as a deviation in a revenue-critical service. Proportional monitoring keeps the program sustainable because it aligns effort with value. Sustainability matters because adherence monitoring must persist over time to prevent drift. To make this tangible, imagine an enterprise with a standard requiring timely review of privileged access and a standard requiring controlled changes for critical customer services. Continuous monitoring might track whether access reviews are completed on schedule, whether unresolved issues are growing, and whether exceptions are being used appropriately. It might also track whether changes to critical services follow the required approval and validation steps, and whether emergency changes are increasing, which can be a sign of instability. Reporting to leaders would summarize whether adherence is within tolerance, which critical services have the largest gaps, and whether the trend is improving. If adherence slips, leadership might fund process improvements, adjust staffing, or prioritize remediation work to reduce backlog. Over time, if adherence improves and incident patterns improve, the enterprise gains confidence that standards are effective. If adherence improves, but incidents do not, the enterprise investigates whether the standards are missing key exposures or whether controls are not effective in practice. This example shows how continuous monitoring and reporting create a feedback loop that supports real governance decisions. As we conclude, monitoring and reporting adherence to risk policies and standards continuously means maintaining steady visibility into whether the enterprise is actually following the practices that reduce exposure. Continuous monitoring focuses on high-impact standards, tracks trends over time, manages exceptions transparently, and uses consistent definitions so results can be trusted. Reporting is designed to support decisions, giving frontline teams actionable detail and giving leaders summarized visibility tied to enterprise impact and tolerances. The strongest programs link adherence to risk outcomes, so monitoring becomes a learning system that improves controls and reduces exposure, not just a compliance scoreboard. When this discipline is in place, governance becomes more credible because leaders can see risk posture changing and can intervene early when drift appears. If you remember one guiding idea, let it be that policies protect the enterprise only when they are lived consistently, and continuous monitoring is how the enterprise proves, in evidence rather than in hope, that its standards are actually shaping behavior over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.